Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, welcome back everyone. Let us get stuck in. So today we're going to be talking about perfect competition. This will hopefully cover a few of the, or at least some of the concerns people have been having in the past about price-takingness of firms. Somewhat, at least they'll be arguing a lot more about price-takingness of firms. Microphone's not, I can hear me. Who can't hear me? Who can't hear me? The which one? The echo is not clear. Is it too loud? I'll talk to the guy. Hi. The front speakers apparently aren't working. Sure, thanks. I really need information. Who can't hear me? Is it, but like, I mean, so that we're going to be, it's already being looked into, but like who just has no idea what I'm saying? Who can't hear me when I speak through the mic? Hand right up when you can't hear me. Yeah, but the recording doesn't work. Okay, I'll just give me 2 seconds. Oh no, he's gone. Come back. Oh. I'm quite happy to have it that the recording this only works for recording and that all the speakers are off.
Really?
Yeah, that's fine. I can speak loud enough for the room. That's fine. This is just for the recording.
Yeah. Do you want to just leave it on? I'll fix the speakers.
Okay, sure.
If you shout into the mic, that'll ruin the levels for the recording.
Okay, sure. Okay. You can probably hear what hopefully you heard to a certain extent what was just said. So we're just sorting out the sound now. In the interim, this is just going to be stuff that I'm saying so I can live without the recording for 2 seconds. I'll talk more about this as we come to it. First thing, quickly, as I say, we missed the last slide or two from last week, so we'll do those very quickly, do some admin, and then we'll talk a bit about some of the aspects of perfect competition. There's going to be a lot of stuff in today, and some slightly subtle stuff in today. Today's far and away the hardest lecture that we've done so far. Difficulty, but we'll see how we go. We'll go pretty slowly through per unit through cost structures of firms in the way that we like to think about them as economists, how economists think about cost structures of firms, where we abstract away huge amounts of stuff. And then we'll talk about perfect competition in a stronger sense when we talk about entry and exit. Finish up from last week. We have market-based approaches. So we talked about duty and taxation. We talked about externalities, and we said externalities for the deadweight loss in the market. When you have the market outcome, you nonetheless have deadweight loss because there's externalities. Affects the other people and affects them positively, affects them negatively. It doesn't really matter. Either way, you end up with deadweight loss. If there's a positive externality, there's deadweight loss if you don't consume enough of the good. And if there's a negative externality, then there's deadweight loss because you consume too much. So if we want to solve those deadweight losses, if we want to collapse those deadweight the way we can do that is by taxing negative externalities and subsidising good with positive externalities. So these are called Pigouvian taxes and subsidies, and a perfectly implemented Pigouvian tax or Pigouvian subsidy, because we choose the level of tax and subsidy to shift production to the socially optimum level rather than to the market level. I didn't say this last week, but tradable permits work in broadly the same way. For tradable permits, so this is how the European Union deals with tradable permits. The market's a little bit iffy, the market actually doesn't work great, but in principle, the idea is that you say this is the quantity that we want, we've worked out the socially optimum quantity, and rather than trying to figure out the level of subsidy that creates that social, level of tax, sorry, that creates that socially optimum quantity, this is the quantity of tradable permits. To be able to produce this good, you need a permit, and then you sell the permit, and then people can trade permits between themselves, and this works out the level of subsidy. So rather than fixing the subsidy, you fix the quantity. You say this is the quantity that we want, and in subsidy through the use of tradable permits, or in this case, the tax through the use of tradable permits. So it's basically you let the market work out how much the tax has to be in order to achieve the socially optimal outcome. The method that we missed last week that we didn't talk about is Coase theorem. Was one of the other ways that we might deal with negative externalities and positive externalities is through property rights. And so a property right gives an agent ownership of some property or resource and the ability to do as they want with that property or resource. You go to people and you say, you now own Australia's air supply, and you can do whatever you like with that. And the reason why assigning specific property rights works is that if I really don't like what you're doing with the air, then I can pay you to stop doing it. Too much, then I can give you money to stop you from doing this. This is the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem states that once you have properly assigned property rights, and then you allow private bargaining, then that private bargaining can also eliminate the externality. They're trading, that's causing externality, and so the people affected by that externality can come to us and can give us money to stop us from trading. It's a negative externality. Our trade is causing negative externalities. So you over here can come to us and give us money to stop producing. And Coase theorem says that if you can do sufficiently good private bargaining, eliminates externalities. We can internalise externalities through this kind of private bargaining. Now, the Coase theorem states that private bargaining can result in efficient allocation, provided that the costs of negotiation are quite small. This is why you can't use private bargaining and property rights to deal with climate change, because the costs of negotiation for that are very, very large. It requires that property rights are sufficiently clearly defined. To do, if I think that I have some claim on the good and you think that you have some, I think I have some claim to say pollute the river, and you also think that you have some claim to not have that river be polluted, but both claim exist ownership over that river, it becomes much more difficult to establish property rights. Should be good? Okay. And we also need that the number of agents involved is quite small. So sorry for the recording, but you can go through the slides. We also need that the number of agents involved is sufficiently small. Again, this is part of why we don't see climate change working. And this is partly as well because this flows through into cost of negotiation. We just can't negotiate when there's 1,000 different people trying to figure out how much money they have to pay to different groups. You can't, in practice, implement this kind of private bargaining. So, private bargaining is frequently not sufficient because most bargaining situations fail one of these three criteria. It's frequently not sufficient. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. The Coase theorem would work well for something like trying to convince your neighbour to trim the trees, to trim their trees, whatever it is, to clean up their yard. You pay them in the sense of you give them you establish a social obligation to them, and they clean up their yard, which benefits you. So, for most economists, if we're looking to internalize a given externality, if we can have private bargaining work, right? If we have all these three, then just let private bargaining work. Private bargaining will end up with a good circumstance. We don't have to get involved. It'll be fine. When private bargaining fails,
This lecture will not be recorded. Well then, possibly this lecture will not be recorded. Let's see how we go. When private bargaining fails, use these Pigouvian taxes or subsidies, or use tradable permits. Can't use tradable permits, then we want to use these. Then we just have to use these ground control. Ground control also works fairly well for really simple problems. If it really is simpler just to say, rather than to say, cocaine causes negative externalities, therefore we're going to tax it, therefore we're going to put massive tax. We can instead just say, no, cocaine is illegal. We just flat out say, no cocaine. This is a command and control style problem. It's not kind of solution. Okay, this is my rant about internalizing externalities. Really questions? Questions, concerns? So close examples would be something like, you really are talking generally about pretty simple things. Most of your transactions that have negative externalities, you're most likely using postage, or you're using this kind of price negotiation. This would be something like trying to convince a neighbour to clean up their garden, right? Trying to convince the person in the apartment next to you to turn down their neighbour. You don't give them money, but you give them social obligation, which has the same kind of flavour. The cost of negotiation is small because it's two people. You just go and talk to your neighbour without doing it. The property rights is really well defined. Your neighbour is allowed to have a messy lawn, right? That's entirely up to them whether they have a clean or messy lawn. We have really clearly defined property rights. There's only two people. They're next door to you. Basically, any time when you ask someone to do something, exploded. Anytime when you just personally ask someone to do something and you pay them in terms of social obligation is going to work here. But also, if you pay the government for the right, when you pay the government for the right to pollute a river, is this kind of framework as well. Just one second. Okay. Can I be heard? Just one second. Can I be heard? I'm being recorded? Excellent. Let's go with this. I'll grab this question, then I'll come across here. Yep.
In item 2 on the next slide,
Yep.
Pigouvian taxes and tradable permits lumped together.
Yes.
Is there logic for that? Because it seems that the tradable permits in the discussion would be preferred to the tax subsidies.
The logic for including tradable permits in the same batch as Pigouvian taxes and subsidies is that they do the same thing. They end up with the same outcome in the sense of the government gets some revenue or pays out some revenue, and by doing so, which in terms of selling these permits, the government gains revenue, and in doing so generates the optimal outcome by changing the price, by making that gap between what buyers pay and sellers receive. Yes, I would say the answer basically to your question is yes. Tradable permits are typically better. The issue is they're typically more complicated. And so it's much easier just to say for every kilo of carbon emissions you produce, we're going to tax you $10, than to say we're producing a market for tradable permits in such and such. I shouldn't have used carbon emissions as an example. For small-scale things, it's easier not to have a market. It's easier just to say this is the tax level. Right? We don't have tradable permits on the purchase of, what's a good example? On the purchase of foodstuffs. Right, purchase of fast food. We tax fast food, and an argument could be made that we should tax fast food on the basis of the externality that it causes, But we're not going to have tradable permits where in order to buy fast food, in order to buy fatty food, I need to have 2 fatty food permits that I can buy from that I can trade with. It's just not worth it. So in lots of circumstances, in big circumstances, tradable permits where each actor is a big actor, tradable permits work really well. When you have lots of little tiny actors, it can be better just to tax, much easier. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Lovely, thanks. Does property rights happen when company merges? When companies merge, they would join their property rights, I guess. But property rights are statements like, if I'm in my yard, I can do what I want. And other people might convince me to do something else than what I intrinsically want by giving me money or giving me social obligation. But it's my decision. Right? When I own an apple, it's my apple. And I can eat it, I can throw it away, I can give it away, I can do whatever I like with it, because I have the property right over this apple. Right? The government owns the river. Right? The government decides what happens to the river. You might pay the government so that you can pollute the river, but it's up to the government whether they accept that bargain or not. That's what we call that. These are property rights. Nice questions. Lovely. Admin. So problem set 1 should be submitted. Grades will be released on Friday of next week. The personal project, the quick one, the mid-semester exam is indeed Tuesday of week 7 at 6:30 p.m. You will have to have a look around because we're in a whole bunch of different rooms. I don't remember which ones, but we're in a bunch of different rooms. But you can go onto timetabling or onto the exams website, and they'll have where you have to go. Rooms are delineated by student number. If you go to the wrong room, you will be sent away to go to the right room. This is just to let you know how they work. The personal project has been released, and so I'll talk about it. And I'll talk about the mid-semester exam more next week. That's the lecture before the mid-semester exam. But I will talk about the personal project. So the personal project is a long-form writing project. You should not think of this as an essay. This is more of a report. But I'm happy for you to think of it as an essay. It's 1,000 words from memory. 1,000 words. And it's due in it's due 21st of May, which I think is week 10 or week 11. It's one of those. It's what it said previously. This is a 1,000-word document which you can produce either as a report in microeconomics or a report in macroeconomics. Given the structure of the course, I suspect that a majority of people will use a microeconomics report, but I'm very happy for you to go either way here. In a microeconomics reports, I want you to be noticing, it's called an economic naturalist assignment, which is that I want you to be noticing things from your own life. Which is to say, I want you to be looking around and notice some behavior in your everyday life, and you look at it and go, that's a weird thing that person's done. That's a weird structure to that market. I wonder why they've done that like that. And that's what I want you to write about. I want you to notice something that you look at and go, that's really odd. I wonder why that's happened. And then to say, why might that have happened? Right, some economic problem where you can look at it and say, why has that happened? And then you answer why you think that has happened. Again, provide some work towards analysing why this happens using the tools developed in the course. You can go a little bit beyond the course if you like, but really we're looking for tools developed in course. Your explanation should include references to work done by others, if there is any, and there often is some. For most of the sort of weird-looking things that happen, usually some people have written something about it, even if it's just a popular economics type argument. You should include appropriate real-world data. You don't have to for the microeconomics one, but you should. So if you're talking about why are wages in some industry higher in Canberra than in Sydney, it'd be good if you went and found the average wage in that industry in Canberra versus in Sydney, right, to find out, and so that you can introduce that real-world data at least a little bit. You should include appropriate graphs, equations potentially, but not necessarily. You can have strictly narrative form where you don't use graphs or equations. That's also fine. It's also potentially fine, discussed without user graphs, and with only reference to your own thoughts, ideas developed in class, and relevant data. This is fine. For some questions, you're going to need to have lots of graphs and some equations. For some questions, and lots of outside research. For some questions, you're not going to need to have very much of that. It'll really depend on the question that you ask. Any questions on these, before I go on and talk about macro, and I'll talk more as well later, about the microeconomic assignment.
So the assumption is before leading up to the break, is that correct?
Yep.
This assignment, there's enough information given to us in the micro part of the assignment to support this commence the lesson.
Absolutely, yes. So the question was, is there enough information in the micro part to commence this? Yes, of course. Obviously, that's not the case for the macro because we haven't done any macro yet. But yes, you wouldn't, only the first 6 weeks are microeconomics, and so you can only use that, and that's all the microeconomics we're doing. So I guess the answer is yes. Alternatively, if you want to, you can do a macroeconomics report where you look at macroeconomic indicators or trends, which you find unusual, and where you think that you might be able to do some kind of economic analysis. You can also do things sort of halfway between these. I would call something like housing prices sort of a little bit macro-y, but also a little bit micro-y. I would call it micro because I'm a microeconomist. I'm sure there's lots of macroeconomists who'd call it macroeconomics, so it's kind of up to you which one you call that. So you want to look at macroeconomic indicators or trends which you find unusual, which you think you might be able to look at more deeply. You can look at why is it that since, this is really bad, Sudan? Which country just split? No, that's not right. Which country just split into North and South? Sudan. Yeah, cool, thank you. You could look at, let's say if you looked at Sudan and you found that when they split, that one half grew faster than the other half. Right? That would be an interesting question to try and figure out why that's happened. And so you'd be going in and looking at the data and trying to make some reason for why that happens. Again, using some of the tools from the course, which will be harder because you'll have less tools from the course, because you only have had a couple of weeks of macro, but that's okay. Typically speaking, this will require a lot more data than a Type A assignment, and here you really have to use real-world data. You don't really have a choice in the macroeconomics version of this, but yeah. Okay, so important details. Due in May, 1,000 words. Submissions through Turnitin and Wattle. It'll be much stricter in terms of how you submit this. It must be the case that Turnitin, unlike the problem set, where I didn't really mind too much for this, it must be the case that Turnitin can read all of your words, which means which means it has to be typed. If you want to include graphs that are handwritten, that's totally fine and absolutely totally fine. But the way you include graphs that are handwritten is you draw the graph on a separate piece of paper, you scan it, you cut out from the scan the bit of the graph and you paste it into your Word document, right? So you need to be able to produce a Word document or a PDF document that is typed, basically, even if some parts have images that you've inserted of handwritten components. This is not quite true yet, but it will be true. Particularly if you're doing a finance master's, you will need to learn LaTeX at some point. LaTeX is an alternative document preparation system that's used to make all of the stuff that I make, and most of your lecturers make in all of your subjects. I do recommend that you use this, particularly if you're in a finance degree, but it's not a requirement. It's just a way of writing things that I find a lot nicer and a lot easier, but it has a bit of a learning curve. And you can have a look online, and I've posted some things. So in here, that's not right. In here, I've posted an installation guide, and I'll post also the text file for the personal project. Has anyone here used LaTeX before? Anyone used LaTeX before? One. It's not a huge number. I would recommend it. It's a really good piece of software, really nice for introducing graphs, particularly for introducing equations. Things just look nicer. Okay, requirements, recommendations. Choose a topic, complete an original report of no more than 1,000 words, write your paper using whichever one you prefer, and submit. I strongly encourage you to choose your topic soon. In an ideal world, especially if you're doing a microeconomics assignment, you want to complete this before you want to choose a topic in the mid-semester break, as in you want to have chosen it, because you want to have time to think about it. That's all I'm saying. Particularly if you're doing a microeconomics assignment, so you have all the information that you're going to be able to use. Basically, choose your topic earlier. If your topic is not working out for you, if you thought this would be really interesting and you look into it and it's actually really boring, then change topic. Right? Don't get wedded to your topic. The help desk times and my office hours times, we're happy to look at drafts. We can't give you we can't say huge amounts, but we're happy to look at drafts and to give guides. And as we saw today, there were quite a lot of students who had trouble with submitting on Turnitin, so please do make sure that you submit early to Turnitin because it can be fiddly, particularly if you've not used it before. And I talk about marking guide. You must use, people always ask about referencing, so I've included it here. References must be provided. I don't care what referencing system you use, as long as it's internally consistent and sufficiently detailed that I can find the information. As long as you have those two things, I don't care at all what referencing system you use, because why would I? I've included here a few good past assignments, which I think are quite nice and ask quite nice questions, particularly the first one and the third one. The first one here says, cinemas and restaurants have these partnership deals where if you go to the restaurant, then you get cheap cinema tickets. Why is that a thing? Right? Some student has noticed this. Some student has gone and seen this and gone, this seems strange that these restaurants and cinemas are working together in this way. Why might that have happened? And then they've gone and done an analysis. The swimming teacher one, this is what I mentioned earlier. This is swimming teachers get paid a lot more in Canberra than in Sydney, or possibly the other way around. I can't remember actually now. Maybe it was more in Sydney. I think it was more in Sydney. Swimming teachers get paid a lot more in Sydney than in Canberra because this student was a swimming teacher in Sydney. They moved to Canberra and kept doing swimming teaching and got paid a lot less and was wondering why that was. And so they did a standard, fairly simple analysis of why that was. We're not looking for hugely detailed, hugely complicated analyses. We're just looking for, something that you find interesting. Okay, questions, comments, concerns. Yes, I would suggest that you talk particularly to your colleagues about your topic, but also to your tutors as well. The tutor will be able to give you some indication of whether you've chosen something that's reasonable or unreasonable, but most topics are good choices. Bad choices of topics are something like, are things where you've not noticed it, particularly Part A topics, where it's obviously something that you haven't noticed. It's obviously something that's just been, you found an analysis online of how some market works, and you've gone, yes, that one. Right? I don't want to read a paper on microeconomics of the whaling industry in the 1800s. Right? That would be a bad choice of topic. But if it's something you've noticed personally, then it's going to be a good choice of topic. Otherwise, questions, concerns? Excellent. In that case, we're super far in, given that we're just now starting. Perfect competition. So, a market is perfectly competitive. So markets that are perfectly competitive can have a few different features to them. The first feature, which is wildly unreasonable and false in every circumstance, is that products and firms are homogeneous. That is to say, our firms are exactly the same, they have the same cost structure, and they produce exactly the same product. All of our firms look exactly the same. And all of the products that those firms produce look exactly the same. And we'll weaken some of these a little bit next week. We still want to have that firms and consumers are price takers. This is because our firms are all homogeneous, there are lots of firms. Right? We want to think of there being a huge number of firms, hundreds and hundreds of firms, and so for each individual, and we want to think of each individual firm being very, very small. We're thinking here about, let's say I've always used Apple, so I'm going to use wheat. We're thinking about, say, the market for wheat. Right? There's 20 million consumers that buy wheat products in Australia. There's 1,000 farms that sell wheat products in Australia, None of these people have any pricing power. If I'm farming wheat, and I double my production of wheat, I still sell at the market price, right? It has no effect on the price because there's 1,000 other wheat farmers. Right? So how much I personally produce is going to have absolutely no effect on the price in the market. Right? If I stop producing, it's not like the price will increase because there's one less person making wheat. it'll just not really change. So we go to the while there will be very, very small changes in practice, we go to the extreme and say there's no change, right? As a firm, I can sell as much as I like at the market price because I'm tiny, right? I'm a tiny little firm, and the market is very, very large. This is my argument for why we have price-taking firms, price-taking consumers. We're thinking about firms being small. Again, next week we'll talk about firms being large. We want to think about firms who profit maximize, consumers utility maximize, right, as we always have. And then towards the end of today, the really key part that makes it a competitive market and not just a market, sorry, makes it a perfectly competitive market and not just a market, as we've talked about in the past, is that we have a pool of firms who aren't yet in the market, but who could join at any time. And so firms can freely enter into the market. I can start up a wheat farm very easily and be just as productive and just as good as all the existing wheat farms. If I own a wheat farm, I can close down very easily. So we want to have firms that can freely enter and exit the market. Again, this is not entirely reasonable, but perfect competition is not intended to be a model of how markets work, really. It's really a baseline model. It says we're going to make a lot of really unreasonable assumptions to try to establish a nice baseline model, and then we're going to modify that in different ways. We're going to weaken our various assumptions to see what happens if firms can't easily enter and exit the market, to see what happens if firms aren't homogenous, if firms aren't price takers. Right? We can deviate from these assumptions. We will deviate from these assumptions, and economists always deviate from these assumptions, but it forms a good baseline. If we have these nice assumptions, then we can see what happens. So we're going to play with this model. We're going to learn about this model so that we know what our baseline is when we then try and deviate to talk about products that are not homogenous, to talk about when firms are not price takers, which we'll be focusing on next week, those two weekends.
So is that based on reasonable assumptions?
These assumptions are, the third one's fairly reasonable. The other three are totally unreasonable in practice. Firms and products are homogenous is sort of okay in very specific markets. Consumers kind of are price takers, but firms aren't really in a lot of cases, or at least, but again, in certain types of markets, they're pretty close to being price takers. Free entry and exit is more or less wildly inaccurate. Yeah, we start off with nice things that are easy to analyze, and then we try and make it more realistic. We start with easy analysis, and then we build realism. So the question is, if all firms are homogenous, if conditions change, if one firm wants to exit, then surely all firms want to exit. We ignore that issue, basically. We say, yeah, they're all homogenous, but they leave sequentially, right, until there's no more profit, which we'll talk about right at the end of today. Okay, a very quick diversion to talk about economic profit versus accounting profit, because it's important for what I talk about today in terms of interpretation. I mean, it's really important for what I talk about today in terms of interpreting what I talk about towards the end of today. So, as an example, Dana and Mung are a team of hit men or hit women for hire. They make $1 million per year in revenue from their hits, and they pay $400,000 in operating expenses, guns, poisons, passports, whatever it is they're using. That means at the end of the year, when they have to go to their shareholders, or whatever, this is a joke, don't worry, they are saying they're going to go and their final report is going to say they made $600,000 in accounting profit. Right? This is what we call accounting profit, which is just revenue minus costs, minus explicit costs, operating expenses, if you like. This way of thinking, this way of doing accounting profit, totally ignores what they could otherwise be doing, which is to say that Dana and Mung have not just spent $400,000 to make $1 million in revenue, they've spent $400,000 and a year of their time and skills to make $1 million. And so this accounting profit ignores opportunity cost, which is going to be important. So instead of being contract killers, Dana and Mung could work directly for ASIS. ASIS is the Australian, MI6, CIA, the secret police, basically. Is Australia's secret police? Not again. Is Australia's secret police? Is Australia's secret police? Okay. Try not touching that. Is it? ASIS is Australia's secret police. Can I turn that off? No, this doesn't have an off option. If I hold it here, ASIS is Australia's secret police. And so let's say that Dana and Mung could instead have worked directly for ASIS and earned $500,000 by doing so. So that means that there's this outside option of working and earning $500,000, which means their opportunity cost is the $500,000 they could get from ASIS, so their economic profit from being contract killers is only $100,000, right? Because they paid the $400,000 in explicit expenses and $500,000 in opportunity cost style expenses. And so their economic profit of doing this is $100,000. So accounting profit is revenue minus explicit costs. I should have said here not costs, but explicit costs, or operating expenses, whatever you want to call it. Economic profit is the difference between current profit and profit from next best alternative, which is to say economic profit is revenue minus all of our costs, explicit and opportunity. In everything that we talk about here, I want you to be thinking about costs as these economic costs, as both the explicit costs and also the opportunity costs. I say all this, and I'll say this again right at the very end of today, because the result we're going to get is that firms post zero profit in the long run. Right? The long run equilibrium is going to be firms post zero profit, which should ring major alarm bells because every report you've ever seen has firms posting positive profit. It's because on annual reports, the number that gets written on annual reports is accounting profit. And that's not what we're talking about here. When I'm talking about profit, when I'm talking about costs, I'm talking about economic profit and economic costs. So this is just something to keep in mind carefully. Okay, let's see what we can do. Any questions? Questions, concerns? Excellent. Price-taking firms. Firms in our world are price-taking firms. They see a market price and they choose how much they want to sell at that price. Importantly, this means that price is the same as marginal revenue, is the same as average revenue. Right? I can sell as much as I like at that price. That means that if I sell an extra good, the amount of extra money I get is the price. So this is my marginal revenue. So marginal revenue and price are the same thing. Because every good that I sell at the price, then price is also average revenue. Again, the reason I'm emphasizing this is because this will not be the case next week when we have monopolies. This means at the firm level, demand is perfectly elastic. At the firm level, firms can produce as much as they like. At the firm level, we have marginal cost, and we effectively have some sort of firm level demand curve, which is the market, which is given by the market price. We have some marginal cost, which is intrinsic to the firm, and they have some demand curve, which is essentially horizontal, some sort of demand curve for the firm. At the market level, we would not expect demand to be perfectly elastic. At the market level, we have different behavior. Okay, short run and long run. So there's a few things to get going at the start. So in the short run, we distinguish between the short run and the long run. Sometimes also distinguish other things, the immediate term, the medium term. But the simplest distinction is short run versus long run. The short run, some things are variable, but some things are not variable. In the long run, we can change everything that we have. When thinking about production in a firm, in the short run, some inputs to production can be varied. In the long run, all inputs to production can be varied. And so we've talked about this a little bit in the past. If I'm trying to make sushi, then I have variable inputs, because I can choose how many workers to pay. And so a variable input is going to be a worker's wage. I can choose how much food to buy to go into my product, and so food inputs is going to be relevant here. I can choose... Hey. Ooh, fancy. Take 3. And going to be super annoying when I have to write stuff down, but we'll see how we go. Yes. This is to distinguish variable inputs from fixed inputs, right? Fixed inputs like the cookware. You buy it once and you have it. This is fixed inputs like rent. You pay it once, or in this case once per year, but it works out to be the same thing, and you have it, right? The amount of sushi you sell is independent of the rent that you pay, right? Once you have the shop, you can sell as much sushi from that shop as you like. Things like developing the recipes, right? Deciding how to make these things. These are all fixed costs. Because we can't change how much of this we use. Similarly, marijuana production. Street level, if you're a grower, then you have to pay your street level dealers, you have to pay for fertilizer, you have to pay for seeds, you have to pay your protection money. Protection is a bit of a tricky one here. You've got to pay these amounts, and how much you produce to sell. Right? If I produce more, I need more street level dealers, more fertilizer, more seeds. I need to pay protection to more people if I'm producing more. Whereas, I only need one grow house. Regardless of how much I produce, I need one grow house to do it. Regardless of how much I produce, I need one set of growing infrastructure. And so these are going to be, largely speaking, fixed costs, at least in the short run. Questions, concerns about fixed versus variable? Yep. The reason why we would think about at the firm level demand being horizontal is because as a firm, right, when I'm thinking of selling my goods, so this is not really a demand curve, this is a firm level demand curve, which is different than the demand curves we've talked about in the past. Because here I'm thinking about, I'm a person who produces wheat. I can sell as much as I like at the market price. That's essentially the same thing as saying that demand is completely flat. Right? At prices any lower than this price, I can't sell anything. Right? At prices down here, I can't sell anything. At prices up here, at this price, I can already sell as much as I like. So it's a function of the firm being price taking. Does that at least address the question? Yeah. Okay. We've talked previously about fixed costs, variable costs, and total costs. Again, fixed costs are fixed inputs. Importantly, in the short run, fixed costs are sunk costs. If I've already bought the cookware to develop sushi, then I've got the cookware, right? And I've already paid for it. So it's a sunk cost. It's in the past, it's a sunk cost. If I've already paid rent, it's a sunk cost. So fixed costs in the short run, we think of as being sunk costs. Variable costs are variable. Total costs are the sum of these two. And previously we've talked mostly about these things. From here on forward, we're going to be thinking a lot more about per unit costs, so about average fixed costs, average variable cost, average total cost. Again, these are just the costs divided by the particular quantity produced. We're thinking a lot about marginal cost, so the cost of producing that last unit, so the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, so the cost of producing that very last unit. Again, change in total cost is the same as change in variable cost we've talked about before, because fixed cost is fixed, right? And so any change in total cost, if total cost increases, it's because the variable cost increases, because the fixed cost doesn't move. We're a bit low on time. This slide really just says, and again, we've said this before, this slide is pointing out, it's trying to emphasize that part of the reason we expect to see marginal costs increasing over time is that we have diminishing what we call marginal productive labor over time. So as we hire, the first worker we hire is really great, the second worker is fine, the third worker is the fourth worker is terrible, right? They're all still beneficial, but they're a lot less beneficial. And so you can work through and do some maths. And marginal cost is this change in variable cost over change in quantity. We divide top and bottom by the change in L, by the change in the amount of labor that we consume or that we use to produce this good. This change in variable cost over the change in amount of labor We call this the wage, right? Because this is the change in how much I have to pay divided by the change in how many people I hire to do the job. So this is the wage, which is fixed. This change in quantity over change in labour, this is our marginal product of labour, the additional production produced by an extra unit of labour. And typically this marginal product of labour is decreasing in number of people I've hired, so it's decreasing in amount that we produce, which means this marginal cost is increasing in the amount that we produce, generally speaking. For normal to high production levels, for very low production levels, we do actually tend to see increasing marginal product of labour, generally speaking, which is why on this graph here I've got this little tiny marginal cost curve sort of flipping up at the end, which is how I'm going to be drawing all my marginal cost curves, because in the real world that's what we seem to see. Right? Yes, the first worker is better than the second worker, but you can do more than 2 times as much stuff with 2 workers than you can with 1 worker, because you can work together. Right? You can specialise, or some things just require more than 1 person. Right? You're trying to build a house. It's a hell of a lot easier with 2 people than with 1 person. Right? More than twice as easy with 2 people than it is with 1 person, because it's easy, because you can carry stuff, you can specialise, whatever. I don't want to talk too much about this though. Any questions? Quick questions? Concerns? Yes. Capital is fixed. In the short term, capital's fixed, and so there's no marginal cost. It just doesn't come up. In the long run, we will have those issues. In the long run, you would have the same kinds of statements for capital. Okay, so a few things about per unit costs. As quantity increases, this is going to be really frustrating. Where did this come from? Okay, as quantity increases, it's a cool noise. As we produce more of our goods, we would expect average fixed cost to fall. Why is that? We expect average fixed cost to fall as we produce more stuff, because fixed cost is fixed, and so fixed cost stays the same, quantity increases, fixed cost divided by quantity goes down. No great surprise here. Average total cost is the sum of these, is the sum of average fixed cost and average variable costs because of algebra. So as Q increases, we have average variable cost is going to look something like this, typically, and average total cost is going to approach average variable cost, because the gap between average total cost and average variable cost is average fixed cost, and average fixed cost gets small as we produce more goods. So average total cost is going to look something like this for a generic firm. We then need to think about marginal cost and how marginal cost looks. And this is where we get some really important things happening that are going to be, and I say these are important because they're really vital for the analysis, particularly if marginal cost is smaller than average variable cost, right? So if the cost of each extra good, extra unit of production is less than the average cost we've paid so far, that means that average variable cost is getting smaller, right? The average cost was $5, the next unit cost $1 to make. That means that the average cost is getting smaller. So marginal cost, right, here average cost is getting smaller, that means marginal cost is less than average variable cost. If marginal cost is less than average total cost, then average total cost, for the same reasons, has to be falling. And similarly, when marginal cost is more than average variable cost, right, if the average cost so far has been $5 each, and then I make a good for $10, clearly that's going to push the average cost up. And that's the case for both variable and total cost. The effect of this is the big thing that I've put in bold here. And if you draw your graphs not including this, you're going to lose tons of marks because your graph is complete gibberish, which is that average total cost and average variable cost have their minimums where they cross the marginal cost curve. That means if I have, this is the minimum average variable cost here, so my marginal cost curve is going to pass through that point. My average total cost curve has its minimum here, and so my marginal cost curve necessarily passes through these minima, right? It has to pass through the minimums because of these four important statements here. So average total cost, average variable cost have minimums where they cross the marginal cost curve. In terms of actually drawing these things, I would strongly encourage you draw the marginal cost curve first, so not the way I did it here. It makes life a lot easier for you to draw the marginal cost curve first and then to draw the average cost curves. It's just easier to draw it in this way. We'll go through a quick example and then I'll take questions. So I've constructed some cost structures for here, well, some cost structures, fixed cost, variable cost, total cost. You'll notice a few things. You'll notice average fixed cost is shrinking, fixed cost is fixed, but average fixed cost is going down. No great surprise, but hopefully clear. You'll notice that marginal cost decreases for low production levels and then increases as we increase production. So we get this little blip at the bottom for marginal cost, which is typical. And variable costs are built from marginal costs here. So I can talk about average fixed cost, which is not that important. I can talk about average variable cost. I can talk about average total cost. You'll notice average variable cost goes down but then up. Average total cost goes down and then up. And these two things approach each other. And if I also add marginal cost in here, you'll notice that marginal cost goes through the minimum average variable cost and goes through the minimum average total cost. And again, this is not so much typical as this is required, right? It is a consequence of the algebra that the minimum average variable cost, that at the quantity level, which minimizes average variable cost, that average variable cost and marginal cost are the same. But the quantity level that minimizes average total cost, marginal cost and average total cost are the same. This is a consequence, a necessary consequence of the algebra. It's a necessary consequence of these four important statements. Okay, questions? Yep. Marginal cost is the derivative of average variable cost. Or it's average total. It's change in average total cost over change in quantity, which will also be change in... It's not the derivative. It is the derivative. It's not how I normally think of this. Change in... Sorry, it's not the derivative of any of these lines. That's why. I was very confused for a second. It's not the derivative of any of these lines. It's the derivative of the variable cost. This is average, and these curves are average variable cost. Yeah, so marginal cost is the derivative of variable cost. It's also the derivative of total cost, because they have the same derivatives. But these curves here are not showing variable cost. They're showing average variable cost and average total cost. So that's why that's the concern. Otherwise, questions, concerns, problems? Yes. It's going to be incredibly important when we talk about entry and exit and that zero profit condition. The significance is that it's built into the algebra of what all these terms mean. The fact that if marginal cost is less than average variable cost, that means, if average variable cost is $5 and then I can make a new unit for $1, then when I make that extra unit, the average cost has fallen. So that means that if marginal cost is below one of these average cost curves, that average cost curve is falling. If marginal cost is, if it costs me if the average cost, is 5 and it costs me $10 to make a new unit, when I make that new unit, the average cost is increased. And so that means if marginal cost is above average at one of these average cost curves, then that average cost curve is increasing. Those two constraints together mean that the marginal cost curve has to go through the minimum average variable cost. It has to cut the average total cost at it, and same for average total cost. It cuts the average total cost curve at its minimum. And as I say, it's going to be really important for why we like competitive markets and for the zero profit condition. Okay. So, our firms are trying to maximize profit. The easy way to do that is to think at the margin. There are other ways you can do this in the problem set one. I suspect many people maximize profit or maximize utility not by thinking at the margin, but it is much easier if you do this by thinking at the margin, particularly here. So the firm increases production until price equals marginal cost and then stops. The firm produces quantity Q0 where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. If this is my firm, and they face some price P, they're going to produce some price P0, they're going to produce this amount Q0 because that's going to maximize their profit. And we can look through, short-run profit for a bunch of different firms. Well, for the same firm, but at different price points. So if we talk about, if this is our marginal cost curve, right, average variable cost and average total cost curves, again, notice pierces at the minimum, cuts through at the minimum. It's very important. If this firm is facing a nice high price P0, they choose to produce an amount Q0, and they make buckets and buckets of profit. Why do they make lots of profit? And why is this graph good? Or rather, why do we bother with this graph? Because we can extract the profit very easily from this graph. Because revenue is easy to extract from this graph, because revenue is just quantity times price. So this whole big rectangle here represents revenue, quantity times price. And we can get costs, we can get total costs very easily out of this graph as well. Because total cost is just quantity times average total cost. Right? Quantity times average total cost is total cost. And so where this big rectangle here is revenue, this smaller rectangle here will be cost. Revenue, big revenue, little cost. Oh, I should have done here. Right, this rectangle here will be cost. And so what's left over is profit. Profit is revenue minus costs. And so we get this nice big green region here of profit. Lovely. High price, we make profit. We can talk about facing what I'm going to call a medium price. This medium price P0 here, we produce Q0. You notice that the average total cost exceeds the price, exceeds the marginal revenue, which is the average revenue, because they're all the same thing. So average total cost, total cost is quantity times average total cost, so this whole big area. Revenue is just quantity times price, this smaller area, and so we get negative profit. We make loss of this amount in red here. I want to emphasize, yes, I do want to emphasize this here. At this point, I want to emphasize that this firm still runs, right? In the short run, at least, this firm still operates. Because if I were to ignore fixed costs, because they're sunk, I've already paid rent, I've already developed my recipe, I've already bought all the cookware, I have all the material, I have all the fixed costs, they're all paid already. And so I'm thinking about whether I want to open my doors today. This firm still wants to open its doors. This firm still wants to open its doors because if I ignore those fixed costs, then I am still making, if you like, produce a surplus. Because if I ignore fixed costs, I have variable cost, and price is still higher than average variable cost. It's still the case, if I open my doors today, I make $1,000 in revenue and only pay $800 in labour and food, variable inputs. So it's still worth opening my doors, but in the long run, we're going to have problems. Because I'm making $200 a day in operating revenue, but I have capital expenses of how much? $100,000? $100,000 a year. So my capital expenses are larger than my operating profit, and so I'm going to have to shut down eventually. But for now, it's worth staying open. This is a medium price. The distinction then with a low price is that low prices are just terrible. Right? This firm shuts down. It makes massive negative profit at this low price, chooses to produce a small amount, makes massive negative profit, and so this is the firm where the price is lower even than average variable cost. So this firm, makes $1,000 in revenue but has to pay $1,500 in salaries for that day to make $1,000 revenue, you're better off just not opening your doors. So, high market price, everyone's happy, positive profit. The medium market price, we make negative profit, but we stay open. We stay open because we've already paid all those fixed costs. So we're losing money, but we'd be losing more money if we close down at this medium price. We could close down, but if we close down, we'd lose even more money than we're already losing. At a low market price, at a low price, that ceases to be the case. At a low price, we just close. Right? There's so little money out there that we just close. The key points here are these 2 points, the break-even point and the shutdown condition. So the break-even point is where we make zero profit. Can anyone tell me, based on what we've said so far, what would be the price at which, or how would we work out from this graph, the price at which we make zero profit, at which our firm makes zero profit? What would be the price at which the firm makes zero profit? I think so. Yep. So they're both correct. It's where we have the minimum average, both answers said where the marginal cost and the average total cost meet, which is true. I would also argue it's at the minimum average total cost. It's the same argument. It's going to be this price point here. If this is the price point, well then we choose to produce the amount Q star, and we make no money, right? We make zero profit. Again, we make zero economic profit. Right? Profit including the things we could otherwise be doing. And so this is our break-even point. At this point, we make zero profit, and zero profit is fine. Price equals average total cost, everyone's happy. The other option is the other point of interest is our shutdown condition, which we'll talk about a lot less. But the shutdown condition where average variable costs, where the price is this minimum average variable cost. And this is our other turning point. If the price is below this, then we shut down immediately. If the price is above this, then it's worth staying open. Maybe only just, but it is still worth staying open. We're losing money. Right? Our profit is negative, but it would be more negative if we or it would be the same amount if we shut down or stay open. Right? We've already paid the fixed cost. This price point here, this has been a bit iffy. This price point here is if I open, I make $1,000 revenue, but I have to pay $1,000 in operating expenses, in salaries. So open my doors, not open my doors today, either way, but certainly in the long run, this is not going to work out for me because I've paid all these fixed costs. Okay, this is all stuff that I've said. Any questions? Questions, concerns, problems? Yes? Surplus you can. It's largely the same as profit. Surplus doesn't include. So you produce. You mean producer surplus? Yeah. Producer surplus just focuses on the variable cost component. That's all. Here we want to think about profits more. In the long run, they'll be the same, as we'll see in a moment. So in the long run, that all collapses anyway. But in the short run, there is this breakdown between producer surplus and profit. But we care about profit here. You can describe this as we shut down if producer surplus is negative. Okay. Long run. In the long run, we can change all of our inputs. Particularly, in addition to being able to change labor, we can also change how much capital we have. We can move to a bigger premises, we can buy better cookware, we can develop better recipes, we can buy a bigger grow house, right? We can change our fixed inputs. Notably, we can make capital changes. Firms with high production tend to use, when we talk about average total cost so far, we've been talking about average total cost, sort of short-run average total cost curves. And so what we have is something that's a little bit strange. So firms with high production tend, generally, to use more capital, as you'd expect. And the reason why firms with high production levels tend to use more capital is because at low quantity levels, the average total cost, this short-run average total cost curve, is lower with low capital, and at high quantity levels, the average total cost curve in the short run
is lower with lots of capital. Let's see how we go. So what I'm saying here is I have quantity, I have dollars, and I can think about low capital and high capital in the short run. So if I have low capital, I have low, this is my average total cost in the short run when I have not very much capital. I start out with quite low costs, but it starts to become very expensive to scale up. And it's expensive to scale up because I don't have that much capital, because I just don't have the capital to be able to do that scaling up. By contrast, I could think about having lots of capital. Because if I have lots of capital, then for low production levels, I have to pay lots for that capital, right? That capital's been very expensive. So for low production levels, I have something like, I have very high, but I can scale up more easily. So this might be my average total cost curve in the short run for a high level of capital. It's not that one is better than the other. It's that the option that is best depends on how much I'm actually wanting to end up producing. From these short-run average total cost curves, we can build a long-run average total cost curves. There's a formal argument here which says the long-run average total cost curve is the locus of the minimums of the short-run average total cost curves, which is a fancy way of saying that for all different levels of capital, right, here we have two extremes. We have low capital and high capital, but obviously we could have lots of different levels of capital between those. We have medium levels of capital, medium high levels of capital, medium low. Right, we have lots of different levels of capital, and we take the minimums. There's a minimum there, there's a minimum there. And so our average total cost curve in the long run, oh dear. It's going to look like this because we go through this minimum, and we have some medium average total cost curve in the short run, right, for a medium level of capital. So we get this minimum here, we have something that does this, we have one here, right, we have lots and lots of cost curves, lots and lots of short-run cost curves. And the long-run cost curve is, well, in the long run, if we want to produce this amount, Q naught, in the long run, the amount of capital that we buy to do that is going to be the thing that minimizes our cost. So in the long run, we're going to choose to buy, this is capital equals 10, we're going to choose to buy 10 units of capital, because that's going to be the level of capital that gives us the eventual minimum cost. So we have lots of different short-run cost curves. Short runs are for fixed levels of capital, and so our total cost curves in the long run, we're going to choose the level of capital that minimizes our cost for any level of production. And so we choose, to produce Q naught, we buy K equals 10 units of capital and then the appropriate level of labor that works this out. Long-run marginal cost curve, long-run marginal cost, is change in total cost over change in quantity, as we always have. And so all the statements we made previously about this operate the same way. Average total cost curve in the long run, marginal cost in the long run. Questions? This is a bit strange, this is a bit unusual, so questions are good here. Questions, concerns, problems? Yep. Yep. Yeah, so the question is, why is in the long run not just the minimum here and then straight across? It's because we're still thinking about like production per year. Even in the long run component here is still production, let's say production per day. It's still the daily production. It's just saying, if I want to produce 1,000 units per day,
how much capital, what's the optimum level of capital that would let me do that? I could have my low level of capital. Right? If I have my low level of capital, then I pay this massive amount per unit to produce this good in terms of average cost. But I can do better than that. I can instead have more capital. I can instead have more capital and have tons of capital and produce at this much lower level in terms of average cost of production. Sure. The question is, yes. The question is, if you have a factory that produces Q1, could you not replicate it? The answer is no. The answer is, if you could do that, then this would not be your average total cost curve. If you could do that, if you could just take the factory, replicate it exactly, then that would be indicative of a long-run average total cost curve that does as you say. Right, that would be indicative of this. Absolutely, it would. But there may be reasons why you can't do that. Right? If I'm a software developer, opening another branch, hiring twice as many workers again, doesn't make things twice as fast. That doesn't mean I produce twice as much quantity, having twice as many people. I would argue that in many firms, certainly most service firms, having twice as many people is not going to mean that you have twice as much production. Part of this is this diminishing marginal product of labour. I built the first factory and I've already hired the best people I can find. So necessarily everyone else that I hire is going to be worse. So that's part of the argument why. But yes, for certain things that scale up really nicely, you will have very flat long-run average total cost curves. Questions otherwise? It's a good question, thank you. Okay. So in the long run, all inputs are variable. Long-run average total cost is the same as long-run average variable cost in the long run, because there's no fixed costs in the long run, because everything's variable. And average total cost is the locus of these minima. So the firm is still price-taking. We still have that price equals marginal revenue. We still maximize profits by producing at the price where price equals marginal cost. Let's use this one. So even in the long run, we still produce at this price equal marginal cost. One of the distinctions between short and long run, and there are many, is that the break-even point and the shutdown point are the same. And that's because we can't keep making per day losses forever, right? Maybe it is the best thing I can do today is to stay open, even though I lose money over the course of the year. The best thing today is to stay open. But if I lose money every year, I have to close. Right? So the shutdown condition and the break-even point are the same. If I'm losing money every day, if I'm losing money including fixed costs every day, I eventually have to close. How are we going for time? We're actually not doing too badly. Okay. Questions, comments, issues at this juncture? Okay. Returns to scale. So returns to scale I want to be very careful with my terminology. I'm going to talk briefly about returns to scale, but we're not really going to talk about returns to scale. We're going to talk about economies of scale, which are very similar in terms of the words, but they mean slightly different things. So returns to scale is a production concept, right? When we're talking about returns to scale, we're talking about production. Constant returns to scale is exactly what you were asking about earlier. Right? Constant returns to scale is I take my factory, I exactly replicate it, and I produce twice as much stuff. Right? So constant returns to scale means if I take a proportional increase in all inputs, that leads to a proportional increase in all the outputs. So in particular, doubling all my inputs doubles all my outputs. And this is going to give us a nice, that's going to be constant returns to scale. And certain things are going to have constant returns to scale. Right? There are going to be particularly sort of low-skilled jobs or a lot of manufacturing jobs. You kind of can scale it up in this way. You kind of can open a second factory and have it be basically as efficient as the first factory. Sometimes we have increasing returns to scale.
which is where we take a proportional increase in all inputs and we more than proportionally increase our outputs. This might happen because you can exploit some specialization, for example, or because some jobs are just easier to do with more people or more capital, potentially. So a lot of construction has increasing returns to scale. Right? You can build if you're trying to build something twice as big, you often don't need twice as many people and capital to build something that's twice as big. Right? Often, not necessarily. You can also have decreasing returns to scale. So decreasing returns to scale, proportional increase in all inputs leads to a smaller percentage increase in outputs. So we double the amount of people that we have doing stuff, and we don't quite double the output that we have of doing these things. So this would be something, in your lives, this would be something like trying to complete an assignment, right? If one person can get 55 out of 100, and person 1 can get 55 out of 100, and person 2 can get 55 out of 100 working alone, together they can't get 110 out of 100. Right? Working together, they can get less than twice as much. So doubling inputs leads to less than doubling outputs. And this is going to be very, very standard when we face any kinds of restrictions on, these are the examples I've used in the past with things like, I own an apple orchard, I use my best land for apples first, I use my second best land second, I've doubled the amount of land that I use, but I've not doubled the amount of apples that I get out of it, because I use my best land first. Very related concepts, but not exactly the same, are economies of scale. That's a typo there. I should say economies of scale. Economies of scale is a cost concept where we talk about long-run cost curves and the way these long-run cost curves look. So economies of scale means a firm has a decreasing average total cost curve. Right? If we have economies of scale, we have a decreasing average total cost curve. Right, here we have economies of scale. Diseconomies of scale means we have an increasing average total cost curve in the long run. So here we have diseconomies of scale. You can also have, it's not quite constant returns, you can also have this, again, this curve being flat, and that's going to be associated largely with constant returns to scale. Economies of scale is associated with, but not the same thing as, increasing returns to scale. Diseconomies of scale is strongly associated with, but not the same as decreasing returns to scale, because one talks about costs and one talks about production. I did have this slide. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I thought I dumped that slide, but I didn't. Most firms look something like this. They have some region where they have economies of scale for low production, where you get gains from specialization, you get gains from having teamwork. They have some level out here where you have diseconomies of scale, where you've already hired all the best people, you already have someone working in every role. To produce extra stuff, you have to have not just more people who aren't as good, more managers and all that kind of stuff. And you tend to get as well some constant returns to scale in the middle. So typically you also get some constant returns to scale for these moderate output levels. The textbook talks about minimum efficient scale, which is this level here, but that's not going to be super important for our purposes. In our purposes, we're mostly going to have long-run average total cost curves. Average total cost curve in the long run. Most of our average total cost curves are going to look like this. I will mention briefly the idea of economies of scope. Economies of scope is a different concept. It's related, but it's different. Economies of scope is where our average total cost declines as we produce different sorts of goods. So this is this idea of if we produce tires and also cars, then we can make money from doing so. We can make both of those things more cheaply if we do both. But we're not talking about it here because here we have single markets that produce homogeneous goods.
A question was asked about firm mergers. The reason why we might see firms merging is because they have economies of scale. Right? It's not a good thing for firms to be living down in this economies of scale section because they could merge and make things cheaper. Right? If I have two firms producing this amount, producing Q0, why would I have two firms producing Q0 and each paying average total cost naught when I could have one firm producing twice as much and paying a lower average total cost? So firms might merge because they face economies of scale. Firms might merge because they face economies of scope. This will be why Channel 9 just bought Fairfax. Will be an argument about economies of scope. Both Channel 9 and Fairfax can make more money by having Channel 9 can make more money by owning a newspaper. Fairfax can make more money by owning a television station, and so they merge. Or potentially they can effectively combine production technologies, but that's well outside the scope of this course. That's where you hire people literally because you think that you can combine the two companies and then work better together. We've done this. Firms break even in the long run when price equals... Yes. No. Okay. So now we're on to the crux of perfect competition. For the last half hour, we get to talk about really the crux of perfect competition, which is not just how firms look or the fact that we have price takingness. It's really firm entry and exit. Firm entry and exit is really going to be driving what happens for perfect competition. So again, we have this short run, long run distinction, but now we're going to add something extra to the long run. So in the short run, and I should say as well, now we're going to really strictly divide the firm level analysis from the market level analysis. Right, we're no longer going to have a single graph. We're now always going to have, or for the rest of today, we're going to have two graphs. We have the firm, and we have the market. I have one firm graph because all of my firms are the same. So, in the short run, our firms choose how much to produce, but they can't change their capital. They can't change how much capital they have. In the long run, they can change how much capital. So yeah, in the short run, they choose how much to produce, but they face fixed marginal cost, average total cost curves. At the market level, the number of firms is fixed. We have a fixed number of firms in the market. In the long run, lots of those assumptions are going to break down. Particularly at the firm level, firms can choose how much capital they use. It's not going to be super important. But the most important thing is that within the market level, the number of firms can change. So we're going to see significant changes in the number of firms in our market. Big key assumptions: all of our firms are the same. All of them have the same cost structures. And there's a big pool of potential firms who could enter the market who would be the same as our existing ones. Right? I produce wheat, and there's 1,000 other farms that produce wheat, and there's another 1,000 places that could enter the market and produce wheat just as efficiently. Again, these are unreasonable assumptions. They're not real-world assumptions, but they form a good baseline. So, let's talk about when firms want to enter, when they don't want to enter, how this whole system works. Before I talk about firm entry, I'll build this in terms of firm entry. I want to talk about this firm market distinction. There are a couple of things that don't change, that aren't decided by anyone. They're just exogenous aspects of the market. The first one is consumer demand. Consumer demand is whatever it is. It's a market level phenomenon. In the market, there is some level of demand, right, which changes with price, but there's a demand level in the market. Nothing that we do today is going to affect the demand level in the market, right, this demand schedule. Similarly, in the short run at least, firms have fixed cost structures, right? Nothing that the firm chooses is going to have any effect on the cost structure. So we're going to have some marginal cost. I'm going to focus on average total cost. Yes. So a bit higher maybe. And some average total cost. These are whatever they are, right? We can't affect these. In the short run, we have a fixed number of firms, right? What this firm object here looks like, what this firm object here means, what this marginal cost curve means, is that if I have some price up here, the firm chooses to produce this amount, right? This price leads to this amount of production. And so when I talk about the market level, and so a function of the firm's marginal cost curve and the number of firms is going to be the supply curve. So we have a supply curve in the market, which is a function of the number of firms, and the marginal cost curves for each individual firm. If there are more firms, the supply curve is going to increase because there's more firms. If costs change, then the supply curve may also change. So this is what the market looks like. And so what's going to happen in this market? Well, the market determines price. So this is going to be the market price P. At the market price P, each firm produces Q. Let's use Q naught, P naught, P naught. There are going to be N firms in our market. Each firm is producing Q naught, and so the total production is N times Q naught. This is production in the market. This looks a little bit fiddly. The reason why this looks a little bit fiddly, why is it that this point that I happen to get to is N times Q naught, where this is Q naught? It's because of how I built the supply curve. The supply curve is just this marginal cost curve, but multiplied out N times, right? Because there are N firms initially. So there's a subtle back and forth between this firm level analysis and the market level analysis. The demand curve in the market is fixed forever. The marginal cost curve and average total cost curve in the firms are fixed forever, or are exogenous. I shouldn't say fixed forever, are exogenous. The number of firms, at least in the short run, the number of firms is exogenous. And the marginal cost curve and the number of firms together build our supply curve, right? Which is just number of firms times marginal cost, right? At any given price, the firm produces Q naught. At price P naught, the firm produces Q naught. And so at price P naught, therefore, the market produces N times Q naught. This is just how we built the supply curve. If I were to have a different level of production, different price, if the price were to be higher, P1, Q1, right? The fact that at a price of P1, each individual firm wants to produce Q1, well, that means that in the market, right, the way we got this point here is because we said this was Q1, and so at price P1, each firm produces Q1. So the market produces N times Q1, and that's how we got this point. That's how we developed this point on the supply curve, right, is by saying N times marginal cost. So the supply curve is built from the marginal cost curves and number of firms. The supply curve and the demand curve work out, and the supply curve and the demand curve in the market level work out the market price. Questions? Any questions, concerns? Yes. And the Q naughts are the same quantity. Yes. Obviously, N times Q naught is not the same as Q naught, but yes, the Q naught's the same quantity, the Q1's the same quantity. This is my point on this somewhat subtle back and forth between these two objects, which is that the firm has its marginal cost curve, which says at each price how much each firm produces. From that we get the market supply, which says at each price what is the total amount that the market wants to supply, which is N times the amount that each individual firm wants to supply. Yeah? Okay. And then we can start talking about entry and exit into our market. So firms want to enter, right? We have all these firms that could enter, right, that are currently making zero zero economic profit by staying out of the market, but they could enter the market. And they're going to want to enter the market if there's short-run profit to be made. If they're looking at this market and going, ooh, all these firms are sitting here making profit. Maybe I should enter the market and also make profit, right? Lots of firms are making apps for your terrible pay-to-win games on your mobile phone. Maybe I should also make a terrible pay-to-win mobile phone game and therefore take some of that profit for myself. The market determines the price which the firm takes, if you like. So I'm going to go through this. I'm going to do one more. I'm going to come back to this graph, but I'm going to do one more thing for emphasis, I guess, which is quantity dollars firm, quantity dollars market. Firms have a marginal cost curve at a price of P0. They choose to produce Q1. That means that at a price of P0, the market chooses to produce N times Q1, right? Because every firm's the same, every firm's making Q1. At a price of P1, every firm makes Q1, and so the market at a price of P1, the market at a price of P1 makes N times Q1, makes this amount. At a low price, P2, each firm makes this small amount, and so the market also makes a small amount. This is how we get the supply curve. This is where the supply curve is coming from. And so when I plop down a demand curve on top of this is going to make it really messy. When I plop down a demand curve on top of this, I can then work out the market price, right? And that's going to give me whether the firm's making, that's going to give me the price and whether the firm is making money or not. Here, we're just in a world where the firm is making money, right? There's sufficiently few firms that our firm here is actually making money. Yes? The exact market supply curve function is really hard to write down, but it's not quite N times marginal cost because you multiply out the quantity. So we talked a few weeks ago about adding firms, adding up multiple firms. So it's not quite N times marginal cost. It's that for any given price, the quantity is N times the quantity is N times this quantity. Perfect. It's N times each firm's marginal cost curve, sort of. Yeah. But where times is timesing the quantity, not timesing the price. Yeah. Okay, firm entry. So we have our firm and our market here. We have this market price P0, and all of our firms are making money. The price is greater than the minimum average total cost, which means our firms are making money. So what happens? In the short run, firms make profit, everything's happy. In the long run, firms enter. In the long run, our firms enter. The effect of firms entering is, well, if I have more firms, if N gets bigger, then my supply curve shifts or pivots out to the right, which drives down the market price. So as more firms enter, right, because there's profit here in the short run, in the long run, more firms enter into my market, more firms enter into my market, supply with N hat, marginal cost. As more firms enter, I get more firms in the market. Each individual firm isn't changing. It's still the same marginal cost, the same average total cost. But with these additional firms, the market price is going to have fallen. So more firms enter the market. As those firms enter the market, the price gets pushed down. And that's going to keep happening. Have I done this well enough? That's going to keep happening until we get to this level P star. Right? More firms enter the market, they keep entering the market, and each individual firm produces less and less because the price gets pushed down as we have more and more firms, and it's going to keep happening until we hit zero profit, right? We get more firms, more firms, more firms. We get to this level here, where the market price is the minimum average total cost. There's no more profit to be had. And so firms stop entering the market. And so again, we're pushing the fact that firms enter the market, the mechanism by which firms enter the market shifts the supply curve to the right, pushes the price down until there's no more economic profit. Here we see each individual firm is making less, but there's more firms, the market quantities increased, the market price has fallen. So, to really reiterate, what column is in red? The equilibrium quantity is lower for each firm. Each individual firm is making less, right? The market is making more, the market's making more because there's more firms. There's more firms, each of whom is producing less, but there's more being sold in total, and there's more and the price is lower. Specifically and importantly, profit is zero. There is no economic profit in this market. Because if there is any economic profit, people want to enter. People will want to enter and take some of that economic profit for themselves. Any questions? Questions, concerns, problems? Okay. Firm exit works exactly the same way, right? If the price is lower than the minimum average total cost, so if firms are making negative profit, we're going to see some firms leave the market. As firms leave the market, we see the supply curve shifting up to the left or pivoting to the left, which pushes up the price, which makes firms more profitable. And so and that keeps happening until firms are back to being zero economic profit, at which point there's no reason to leave. If I'm making zero economic profit, that means the next best thing I could be doing gives me the same profit as what I'm currently getting, so I have no reason to leave. So firm exit works exactly the same way, but it's when the price is lower than minimum average total cost, people will start to leave the market until we end up at the equilibrium, if you like. I can go through if someone asks, I can go through the graphs. Otherwise, I will move on to talk about other things. So any questions? Yep. Sure. As a quick note on taking photos, I'm happy for you to take photos. I also would encourage you not to take photos. Writing it down gives you a lot more insight into what's happening, taking photos. But again, if you want to take photos, I have no issue with this. I find that I learn a lot better if I write it down, and I believe that most people learn a lot better if they write it down. But I'm happy for you to do whatever makes you happy. Any questions on firm exit? Yep. Yes. Firm exit is, I'll do a very quick graph for it. Firm exit is where we don't have enough firms. So firm level, marginal cost, average total cost, market, quantity, dollars, demand, we have low price. Supply. So we have tons of firms in this market. It's actually not enough. We have supply, naught. So we have tons of firms in our market. We have some market price, P naught. Our firms are making, each firm chooses to produce Q naught. That means this amount here is N naught times Q naught, where N naught is the initial number of firms. Every firm is losing money. Every firm is making negative profit. So firms will start to leave the market. Firms will leave the market, pushing the supply curve up
pushing the supply curve up to supply curve S, or let's say S1, and firms will keep leaving until the price is at P1, at which point firms will stop leaving the market. So here we have each firm's producing an amount Q1, firms have left, so we have N1 is less than N0. So we have fewer firms producing more goods. The price and the market price is going to be higher. So firms have left, fewer firms. Each firm is making more stuff. The amount of stuff produced in total has decreased. The price for those goods has also increased. And profit has been pushed back down to zero by the exit of firms. Otherwise, questions? Firm exit. Yep. Yep. The intuition, so the question's about, again, this two factory idea. If you have two factories owned by two firms, you still have maybe one management. So if you wanted to talk about it being on this part of the curve, you'd be talking about, say, to combine them, you have to introduce a new layer of management. And that new layer of management is sufficiently expensive that we increase our average total costs, our average costs, as we build another, to build a new factory, we have to have a new layer of management, which costs us more money than it's worth, potentially more money than it's worth. Well, it might be, if factories being separately owned might be more efficient. There's going to be an optimal number of factories, I guess is the point. Maybe it's one. Maybe the optimal thing to have is to have each firm having 5 factories. But any more than that is not worth it. It depends on the market. Okay, long-run equilibrium. An industry is in long-run equilibrium, and we really like long-run equilibrium, when firms have no incentive to exit or enter the market. So that is when price is the minimum average total cost in the long run. This is lovely, right? So this is this idea of, this is not so much short-run average total cost curves, the market level, marginal cost long run, average total cost in the long run, assuming that's the minimum, demand, supply, given by the current number of firms, and the long-run marginal cost curve. Each firm produces Q star, the market produces times, and everyone's happy. Right, this is our nice long-run equilibrium when every firm is making zero profit, so no one has any incentive to leave, when we have the appropriate amount of capital to make all this happen, and so that's endogenously determined the number of firms, so that's worked out the number of firms that makes that happen in the long run. So this is lovely. Price with marginal cost, we have lots of nice desirable features. Our average total cost in the long run is minimized. So our goods are being produced at the lowest possible cost that they could be, right? Because long-run average total cost is as low as it possibly can be, which is great. So this, I guess, this comes back, I guess, then to your question of we would always be producing way back here. Yes, in the long-run equilibrium, every firm produces an amount Q1. In the long-run equilibrium, that is what we end up with, because anything else is not optimal for the individual firms. You'll have more firms entering or firms leaving until you get to this nice long-run equilibrium. The market ultimately, the demand curve works out. The demand curve locks down the number of firms. Yes. And we also have that capital is allocated efficiently. All of our firms neither have too much capital or too little, which is a problem that we have in the short run. Right? In the short run, maybe we've got too much capital. So, the take-home so far at least
because there's one more take-home in the last 6 minutes, but the take-home so far is that long-run equilibrium in perfectly competitive markets is fantastic. It's fantastic because in addition to all the other things that we've talked about in terms of Pareto optimality, we also have that we've minimized average total cost in the long run. So we also have this really, really solid, really fantastic production production efficiency. So in addition to being Pareto efficient, we also have this really nice production efficiency. When we have free entry and exit of firms, the free entry and exit of firms here driving lots of our results, or driving all of our results. The question is whether you would conduct sensitivity analysis from this point in a business sense. I don't know. The short answer is I don't know. The long answer is you'd probably want to conduct your sensitivity analysis in the real world from your current position. But the short answer is I don't really know. I'm sorry. Okay. Comparative studies, because there's one more take-home that we need. So we want to think about what happens in this model if we increase demand. So we take our nice model here, and we see a demand increase, and we want to think about what happens in the long run. In the short run, long run, firm level, and market level. Let's start off with a new piece of paper, and in the short run. Firm, market, marginal cost, average total cost. D naught. This marginal cost curve gives us a supply curve. We're thinking about, oh, no. No, I need to start again. It's too far away from what I want. Firm curve, firm graph, market graph, marginal cost, demand curve, average total cost, supply. So we're thinking about our market starting off in equilibrium. Everyone's happy. Then we want to say, each firm is producing P naught. Sorry, each firm is producing Q naught. The market's producing capital Q naught, or N times Q naught. We want to think about what happens if there's an increase in demand. Well, the short-run effect is pretty straightforward. In the short run, demand increases. That means that the market price increases. Right? That means that the market price increases because this supply curve is fixed in the short run. That means each individual firm produces more, but in particular, each individual firm is making profit. So our firms here are now making profit. And this is our short-run analysis. The short run is just demand increases, price gets pushed up, every firm increases how much it produces, N times Q naught, say N naught, N naught times Q naught. Every firm increases the amount it produces, but number of firms doesn't change, and firms make profit. The long run is very different. In the long run, what we observe is increase in demand, increased market price, positive short-run profit. In the long run, that means firms enter. Right? If there's positive profit to be made, firms are going to enter the market, and the effect of firms entering the market is they're going to shift the supply curve right as we get more and more firms, and they're going to keep doing that until until profit is gone. Basically, until price has been pushed back down to this initial level P naught. So we're going to keep seeing more and more people entering, more and more firms enter the market until we get to S1, right? Because at any less, right? If we're up at here, if we're up at this level of supply, right? A small increase in number of firms, each firm still making profit. That draws more firms in. So we're going to keep drawing more and more firms in until the price has been pushed back down to the initial price. The price has been pushed back down to the level where there's no profit possible. And so we're going to see more and more firms entering into the market until there's
N1 times Q0 until we're back at the initial price and quantity decision, now just with more firms. So if demand increases, yes, in the short run that drives profit, but the profit brings in more firms, and those more firms push that profit back down, and we end up with the same price, minimum average total cost, and the same, and so therefore the same level of profit, zero. So we result in